just walking with Savannah, my manager,
Yeah.
because we do like these little evening walks. And I just looked up to her and I was like, dinosaurs, that seems pretty fake and gay. She's like, she's Savannah's from Tennessee. She's like, I've never believed in dinosaurs. Like literally, this is, everyone thinks there's like some conspiracy behind it. I was like, that was how it started. And I was like, what on earth? You rawr. I'm like, it's funny because people will literally say they don't believe in God, but then tell them like dinosaurs aren't real and they fall apart. Like, I'm like, okay, so they're just roaming the planet. And I was like, that's really interesting. But then because I got into and very much subscribe and believe and know to be true that there is a Christ conspiracy that's happening right now, which is the intentional removal of Christ because they want people not to believe in God, but instead to believe in humans. Well, that is what evolutionary theory was about. Because rather than making human beings believe that they had a creator, there was no concept of a dinosaur until 1850. That's very recent, right? That's the first time they were like, we actually think that there were these reptiles that are roaming the planet. And then within that same decade, they were like, dinosaur bones.
Oh, well, I am Ben Burgess. This is Give Them an Argument. I'm joined as always by our super producer, Jake Appett, and our very talented graphic designer, J. Andrew World. You just heard a friend of the show, Candace Owens, making, I don't know, one of the saner comments. I'll give it like a 3 out of 10 on the Candace Owens insanity scale that I've heard from her in a while. But this is a forum for discussion of challenging ideas, so I don't want to rule anything out. Guys, what's your take on this? Dinosaurs. Fake, gay, fake but not gay, gay but not fake. Where are we at with this?
I mean, Andy, I think you're the one who feels the most passionate about dinosaurs on the screen. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I mean, you know, there are two things you don't do: is come at trans people and come at dinosaurs. And you know, clearly,
okay, dinosaurs weirdly does it come around and it's okay to criticize them?
I'm sorry.
The trans dinosaurs, like is that particular? You know, I mean,
I've not read the science on it, so I will be I will confess that I'm sure that there was a small percentage of trans dinosaurs,
right? In terms of the sexuality or the gender preferences or how they wanted to be referred to. I'm sure that there's some
gay dinosaurs, like
I don't think. Just I mean,
there's
if you look
penguins,
at
so why not gay dinosaurs?
There's a pretty big prevalence of it scientifically, right, throughout most species. But I think she might mean more like lame, right? Which is kind of an archaic way of using that word that we don't really use it anymore that way. I think Republicans, if they go with that, they're going to start losing the youth vote, by which I mean like really, really youthful, like second, third graders are not going to grow up to be Republicans if they keep pushing this anti-dinosaur talk. So I think they should drop it.
Yeah, that's
for their own sake.
Weird take, because I remember going to summer camp when I was in high school, and they made us watch a video about how dinosaurs are just lizards that are really old because of thermodynamics. You know, like how energy changes form, it loses quality. So therefore, people used to live a lot longer. Look at Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible, and therefore dinosaurs are just like regular sized lizards that just keep growing because they don't die. And that was the creationist theory I was being taught in high school.
Awesome.
Which completely contradicts Candace Owens.
Yeah, I mean, just I don't know. It's always fascinating to see how her mind works. There are people who don't even believe in God, but they believe in dinosaurs. Well, I have pretty direct evidence of one of those things. Right? It doesn't seem unreasonable to me that there would be people who don't believe in the one that you would have to, take on faith, or at least there's some more complicated reasoning to get you to believe in it. And you do believe in the one that you have bones from. And if I don't know, are we just supposed to generally not believe in things that people didn't know about before 1850?
Yeah, I mean, we've only had coming up on 200 years of this. What about scientific inventions that come after? What about scientific discoveries that have been made in the last 20 years? That's just ridiculous, right? That is quantum, not that this is 20 years old, but quantum mechanics, that is new. That is new stuff. So,
way newer than dinosaurs.
Yeah, so obviously false. Obviously false.
Yeah, or like the, I mean, I don't know. It's like the DNA was like the mid 20th century, right? The
Yes.
double helix. So DNA is surely fake and gay.
Well, you know who were two of the biggest antichrists? Watson and Crick were actually, it was a conspiracy to try to take out the Holy Spirit out of schools, right, and replace it with something equally fake, or not equally fake, fake and gay DNA.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if Candace said that, honestly.
I just want to see that, like, that's like God's real because here's his bones, like, the most Nietzschean anthropologist.
Yeah, although that would actually be that would really like change the terms of the debate, right? Because it's usually, does God exist, present tense, yes, or God never existed. This would be, he used to.
Yeah,
I want to see Herzog narrate the documentary about the search for God's bones.
Yeah. Okay, I would watch that. So yeah, later today with our guest, Professor Vivek Chibber, I'm going to be talking about some things I think that the left is often wrong about and short-sighted about, but I think it's important to keep in perspective the level of foolishness on the other side of the barricades. But in any case, what else are we talking about here? I know, Jake, you had mentioned you did your duty as an American and watched the game yesterday. Now, I myself did not. I'm protesting. I was protesting the fact that the Lions didn't get in. I don't know what exactly I'm protesting, the universe or fate, but I was protesting something, so I didn't watch. But you did, right?
Yeah. I was flattered that you thought that I might be watching, because it means, obviously super macho football watcher type of guy. I don't watch all the time, but we just happened to watch it. And funny you mentioned protest, because no offense, but I think there was a more meaningful protest during the game, which I did not see on the televised version of the game. It was only later. It was that it turned out it was one of Kendrick Lamar's backup dancers held up a flag that I believe was basically love to Sudan. It was like a heart Sudan and then a fist with Palestine. And they were the dancer was promptly, chased and tackled as if they had like a firearm on them. You know what I mean? And then I think, fortunately, they were trying to find a reason to try them, of a crime. And the problem is it wasn't like a streaker or something. He was paid to be there, right? So the crime would have had to have been like, you're hired for one type of dance and then you like wear the wrong shirt or something like that. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't.
Which is usually not something the police take an interest in.
No,
the fashion police maybe.
Yeah, the fashion. You'd maybe be like not hired by the same dance company again,
Sure.
or fired. You know what I mean? Turned out, which was also kind of dramatic. I think he's banned from NFL stadiums, which for me would be one of the lightest punishments imaginable. For Andy, might actually be a positive, but still kind of intense. And
I mean, you think I'm wearing this cowboy shirt because of blue and silver for no reason?
Big, yeah. Andy's personality completely changes off screen, mostly NFL talk. Dinosaurs and my Cowboys are the two things you don't come after. But yeah, it was just really wild to see. And you don't want to speculate too much. We were talking about this earlier, Ben, about like what if it was a different message, but it's just striking to see how dangerous they felt this message to be, and the level of repression that was on display. And then obviously there weren't too many conservative free speech warriors saying like, oh, it's his right to, I mean, it wasn't a hateful message, right? It really was a fist and said Palestine and Sudan. I mean,
yeah,
it's
and he
about
was
as mild as you can get while still
like,
showing
okay, you don't have like a capital R right to whatever, hold up signs, was a backup dancer. I don't know. This is the most I've ever thought about that issue, but that's but like, I don't know. I mean, you look at how much some of the people you're talking about have gotten upset about people like having overly draconian punishments for things that were like much more clearly illegal, like like January 6th protesters, going inside, forbidden, the Capitol, even if they didn't do anything further illegal, or things that people have done in anti-abortion clinics that they've thought that there's too harsh repression for, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that, like, sure, do we know, like, I was saying earlier in the production meeting, I don't love speculating about what it would have, like, what the response would have looked like if it was a different message, because we just don't know. And it's I suspect it would not be as harsh, but maybe it would be, and whatever. I think it's a secondary issue, because I think if it was, that would also be a problem, right? Because it's not like I just want there to be a more consistently heavy-handed and censorious reaction to protest. That that's the issue. But I think that I think that the real the real issue here is that this is in general the single remotely mainstream opinion that that you get the most heavy-handed response to in the United States is Palestine. I mean, I'm sure we could come up with examples of things that are really fringe, with, I don't know, NAMBLA, Holocaust deniers, whatever, right? But it's like, outside of stuff like that, right? It's Palestine, and in some ways, it's just Palestine in an absolute way. I mean, you have, like, was it the majority at this point of U.S. states have laws on the books that penalize people, and for boycotting Israel, right? You're allowed to boycott anywhere else, right? But you're not allowed to boycott Israel.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting. Again, we don't know what would have happened, but like if you look at what he was holding up, I mean, it had a small fist, right? So that implies, I guess, maybe power to free Palestine or whatever.
Sure.
But basically, just holding up a Palestinian flag would be seen as this like electric protest. It's just literally acknowledging that they exist is the protest. And obviously, in the current context, we understand what it is. But there's, you know what I mean? But it's like that would be treated by people as this like third rail to even like just holding up a flag of like, yeah, I'm thinking about them. It's like, and that's enough for like all the right people to understand exactly what it means, and to want to suppress it is kind of wild. It's really almost as basic a statement as you can make. Like, this exists. You know what I mean?
Well, on that subject, let's talk about Gaza, because something that I said several times last year during the election was that I thought that Trump would find a way to somehow be even worse than Biden on Israel-Palestine. And a lot of people, let's be clear, this is a totally reasonable and understandable reaction. A lot of people said, how could he possibly be worse? Some people even pin their hopes on the desperate gamble that somehow despite some of the things he was saying, he might actually be better. And hey, the Israelis did give him a ceasefire as a kind of housewarming gift for assuming office, the same way that they gave Obama one in 2009. Look it up, by the way. In 2009, there was after the 2008-2009 Gaza war, there was a ceasefire that started on January 18th, 2 days before Barack Obama took office. And famously, the Israelis didn't even like Obama, right? Even before he really started pissing them off with stuff like the Iran deal. Trump, they love. He's the guy who unilaterally tore up the Iran detente, who moved the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem after several decades of presidents from both parties not wanting to certify Israel's illegal annexation of East Jerusalem by doing that, who started referring to the West Bank in official documents as Judea and Samaria, who officially dropped the official U.S. position that the settlements were illegal, not mind you that this position was doing the Palestinians in the West Bank any good, but that's what the official position had been since there had been settlements, and Trump was the one who dropped it. And during the debate with Biden, in between Biden's brains dribbling out of his mouth, Trump actually accused Biden of having become Palestinian, a bad Palestinian. He also said that Chuck Schumer had become Palestinian. So Netanyahu wagered that he was going to get a lot more out of Trump than he would out of Biden. And he held off on taking a ceasefire deal that had been on the table for several months so he could give it as a housewarming present to Donald Trump. I'm not saying that's all that was going on. There were all kinds of reports of Trump himself offering both carrots and sticks to Netanyahu so he'd have the diplomatic accomplishment to hold up at the outset of his presidency. But I do think it's a lot of what was going on. And while I'm obviously hoping for the best, how long the ceasefire holds is anyone's guess. To the extent that it even is holding, the IDF has already been interpreting ceasefire in pretty creative ways, and we could be back to all-out shooting war at any time. So if you'd asked me last year what I thought would happen in that scenario, I would have said Trump does the same thing as Biden, but a little bit worse. During the election, he accused Biden of holding Netanyahu back and said that we should do the opposite. And there have already been signs of that. Trump ended Biden's pause on 2,000-pound bombs, for example. So that all fits with what I would have expected last year and what I talked about in the video I did just before the election. But Trump has actually found a way to float an idea that's about 1,000 times worse than what I was expecting. When Netanyahu visited him, Trump said, well, let's roll the clip of what he said.
The U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip, and we will do a job with it, too. We'll own it and be responsible for dismantling all of the dangerous unexploded bombs and other weapons on the site, level the site and get rid of the destroyed buildings, level it out, create an economic development that will supply unlimited numbers of jobs and housing for the people of the area. Do a real job, do something different. Just can't go back. If you go back, it's going to end up the same way it has for 100 years.
Got that? Whatever wasn't destroyed in those 15 months of carpet bombing, whatever is left standing, the U.S. will level out. And then the United States is going to take long-term ownership of Gaza and turn it, presumably free of any Palestinian inhabitants, into the Riviera of the Middle East, Maragazo. And by the way, I saw some of the world's most insufferable lib commentators saying shit like, oh, wow, I'll bet all those Arab American voters in Dearborn who went for Trump feel dumb now. You know, those guys just got owned, which is honestly sickening almost beyond belief on multiple levels. First, I'm perfectly happy to give tactical advice about how to vote to anyone who, asked for it. But going beyond that to finger wagging and voter shaming has always been ridiculous. It's like that Bertolt Brecht poem, Die Lösung, where he's talking about the Stalinist ruling party in East Germany putting down a strike and putting posters around East Berlin saying that the workers will have to work twice as hard to regain the party's confidence. And Brecht asked, would it not be simpler for the government to dissolve the people and elect another? It's the job of politicians to appeal to voters. And I'd say that on any issue. I don't even like shaming just outright conservative-leaning voters who voted for Trump for straightforward ideological reasons, because frankly, it's our job as the left to get working-class Trump supporters to switch, to a better perspective by giving them a material program that won't peel off the most hardcore Trump voters. Nothing can do that, but it can at least peel off whoever's peel-offable. If you voted for Trump because of the price of eggs, instead of saying, now eggs are even more expensive, you morons, Democrats should have been pushing for policies to control inflation, or at the very least done a better job of naming and shaming corporate price gougers, like in fact Morena did in Mexico. That should be our focus. But it's particularly sickening to see that, you idiots got what you vote for stuff on the issue of Gaza, of all things, when the Biden-Harris policy was so grotesque. I've seen estimates where something like 95% of the population of Gaza was internally displaced, and even the most conservative estimates have something like, at this, that are all realistic, have something like 3% of the population killed, which is a scale of mass death that as Americans, as people who haven't seen a war fought on our soil since the 19th century, we can't even begin to wrap our minds around. And the whole time, Biden kept signing the checks, Anthony Blinken kept providing cover to Netanyahu, and Kamala Harris never once so much as hinted that she'd do anything different, even after the warning from all those uncommitted votes in multiple states that were bigger than the margins that decided the 2016 and 2020 elections in those states. Even after warning after warning after warning, she held the exact same course and never broke from what the pro-Israel lobby in the Democratic Party wanted to hear. She didn't even let, famously, a Palestinian speak at the DNC. Basically, the Harris campaign took every opportunity to give people protesting the horrors in Gaza the middle finger. And after all that, you don't get to turn around and be smug about the fact that some of those people couldn't bring themselves to vote for you. And look, I say this as somebody who, sure, I wrote in Rashida Tlaib for president because I live in California. It's not exactly a swing state. It really could not have mattered less what I did. But if I still lived in Michigan, right, I would have held my nose, cast a lesser evil vote, and gone home thrown up. But the idea of getting mad at any voter who couldn't bring themselves to make that choice is just obscene, especially when you're talking about people, in Dearborn who might have actually had cousins who were murdered or dismembered by U.S. manufactured bombs in Gaza. It's just vile. But enough about the Democrats, because frankly, they've become irrelevant. They don't control anything. I want to talk about the people who do run every branch of the federal government right now. Let's roll that second clip of Trump when reporters start pressing him about whether the Palestinians, who he said would be removed from Gaza while he's leveling all the buildings and turning it into the Riviera of the Middle East, would ever be allowed to come back. Here's what he says.
Would Palestinians have the right to return to Gaza if they left while the rebuilding was happening?
It would be my hope that we could do something really nice, really good, where they wouldn't want to return. Why would they want to return? The place has been hell. It's been one of the meanest, toughest places on earth. And right now, I've seen every picture from every angle, better than if I were there. And nobody can live there. You can't live there. So if we can build them through massive amounts of money supplied by other people, very rich nations, and they're willing to supply it. If we can build something for them in one of the countries, and it could be Jordan, it could be Egypt, it could be other countries, and you could build 4 or 5 or 6 areas. It doesn't have to be one area, but you take certain areas and you build really good quality housing, like a beautiful town, like someplace where they can live and not die. Because Gaza is a guarantee that they're going to end up dying. The same thing's going to happen again. It's happened over and over again, and it's going to happen again as sure as you're standing there, Peter. So I hope that we could do something where they wouldn't want to go back. Who would want to go back? They've experienced nothing but death and destruction.
Got that? The United States on this proposal would take long-term ownership of the single bloodiest conflict zone on the planet right now, expel every single one of the people who live there, and just hold on to power forever. And while all this is going on, Hamas will do nothing, Hezbollah will do nothing, the Houthis will do nothing, and all those Gazans never allowed to return home won't engage in any sort of armed resistance to that, the way Palestinians did after the first Nakba. Let's be clear about this. What he's talking about, if it ever somehow happened in real life, would absolutely guarantee a war in the Middle East on a scale that would dwarf what's come before in previous American wars. Of course, you can argue it's never going to happen. So what am I getting so excited about? Well, I'd make 2 responses to that. First, if it's not going to happen, it's going to be because there's so much outcry and pushback, primarily in the Arab world, but in all sorts of places. And I absolutely think that Americans should add their voices to that chorus. But second, the fact that Trump is even floating an idea like this tells you absolutely everything about who and what he is. The original premise of MAGA populism was twofold. First, that Trump and his movement were going to be America first. They weren't going to be like those neocons starting endless wars in the Middle East. Even playing with this idea about Gaza shows you exactly how serious Trump is about that. Second, these weren't going to be like the old Wall Street Republicans who pushed free trade deals and guest worker programs and left the Rust Belt to rust in the sun because Trump is an economic populist. And my answer to that would be the same as the therapist's answer to Carmela Soprano in the episode where Carmela decides to try therapy herself, and the therapist ultimately tells her he won't see her, but during their one session, she tells him that her priest says she should stick with Tony and try to make him a better man, and the therapist says, well, how's that going? As of now, this segment is going to be dated in about 3 hours. Things are moving so fast, but as of now, here's how MAGA economic populism is going. Elon Musk's pseudo Department of Government Efficiency is moving through the federal government, taking a wrecking ball to every regulatory body that's ever cost him $1. He's gloating on the platform he brought about how he's basically shutting down the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. He tweeted, CFPB RIP. So these are the regulatory cops stopping credit card companies from milking you as much as they want to with nonsense junk fees. And then the Trump administration announced this morning that they're reversing 2 big specific CFPB BP policies, one on overdraft fees and the other banning companies from including medical debt in credit records. And as egregious as that is, in the long run, it's going to be small change compared to the other seismic shift, which is on the National Labor Relations Board. And I know a couple of internet Marxists who want to be edgy and contrarian. I've seen have this anti-NLRB take, like, oh, see, this is actually holding back some wave of worker militancy to have an infrastructure of labor protection, so we'll be better off. But I'm sorry, that's brain dead. Let's take a second to think about what a world without the NLRB might look like, because as of now, I just filed an article about this. That's the world it looks like we're entering. Right. So last Thursday, the NLRB announced its intention to essentially commit institutional suicide. Right. Because at the end of January, Trump essentially shut it down by firing one of its members, which the law very clearly says he can't do. But I think he made the calculation that he can at least get a lot out of shutting it down during however long it takes the courts to address this. And the effect of firing this member, Gwen Wilcox, means that the NLRB is below the quorum it needs to operate beyond any issues that can be handled by regional offices. Meanwhile, Elon Musk's SpaceX a while back filed this challenge with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit to rule the very existence of the NLRB, or at least its big enforcement powers, unconstitutional. And a few days ago, right, the board sent the court a letter saying, yeah, since we're below the quorum that we need to continue making decisions, we can't contest in court this challenge of unconstitutionality. And similarly, as this is happening, DOGE took aim at the Department of Labor, which, so that's the next target for the wrecking ball. And it certainly remains to be seen how either of these cases will play out. It's possible as of now that other interested parties will be able to defend the NLRB in court, and that despite the conservative supermajority on the U.S. Supreme Court, the agency's existence will somehow be preserved. Whatever happens, though, it's clear that the Trump administration is waging a scorched earth campaign against organized labor that goes well beyond anything that Trump did the first time around. Back then, Trump did what any Republican would have done, right? As our friend and former guest Paul Prescott wrote at the time, right? Trump's appointees to the NLRB were delaying union elections, restricting the ability of employees to communicate about workplace issues, and enhancing the ability of employers to determine bargaining units, right? That's exactly the kind of people who would do all that stuff, are exactly who you would expect a Republican to appoint to the NLRB. But now Trump is going much further. He's going after the basic infrastructure that was won in the 1930s to protect the right of workers to form unions, right? So imagine that you're involved in an organizing campaign at your workplace and your boss comes up with some excuse to fire you. If that was spurious, right? This is a violation of the National Labor Relations Act, but any law is only as good as its enforcement mechanism. The NLRB routinely handles such complaints, and it often hands down rulings forcing companies to reinstate illegally fired workers with back pay. But if this happens to you after Musk's constitutional challenge to those enforcement powers goes through, and the agency is either abolished entirely or stripped of those basic powers, you might have to wait for years to get action through the regular court system. even if the trial goes your way and then you get your job back with back pay, how exactly are you supposed to support yourself during however many years it takes for your case to get through the courts? Meanwhile, after your fellow workers have seen what you and your family went through during those years, how likely are they to take a similar risk? And this kind of assault on the fundamentals of workers' rights should certainly be enough to, to put to bed any idea that, that anybody on certain corners of the left might have, that there's been some kind of meaningful realignment on economic issues, not just in terms of who votes for who, but in terms of policy. But it's also maddening to see how little emphasis this issue has gotten by certainly the Democrats, who have, gone to bat for, USAID, in fact, often on the grounds that it's important for, countering Russian and Chinese influence. So, in a way that actually reinforces the Trumpist narrative that Trump is an anti-interventionist, and the Dems are neocons. And I'm not sure why Democrats would think that most ordinary Americans care about making sure the U.S. can engage in a sufficiently aggressive battle with China for influence on the internal politics of distant countries. But most Americans do work for a living. And there is a witty message here, right? So one of the things I want to talk about with tonight's guest, Vivek Chibber, is about how a lot of lefty or progressive type people, even some people who might think of themselves as socialists, aren't at all strategic about how they push back against the mudslide of horrifyingly reactionary initiatives pouring down from the White House and Mar-a-Lago right now. Not all responses work equally well. If the left just tails the liberal wing of the culture war or insists on, putting a plus wherever, conservatives, Republicans, and Trumpists put a minus, right? So people are even, it's like, oh, if they're against DEI trainings, we have to be in favor of, mandatory DEI trainings at work. That's just going to be a catastrophe. And parts of that discussion are simple, others are more complicated. But here's one part I'm absolutely sure of. If you want a effective anti-Trump message, this guy wants to make it easier for credit card companies to rip you off, and he wants to make it easier for your boss to fire you. It has to be at its center, right? All day, every day. Shout that from the rooftops. All right. All right. So I want to set up our guest for tonight, Professor Vivek Chibber. So I want to just say a couple things about him in the context of what we're having him on before we bring him onto the screen. So one of those is that, the immediate context for this is that he did an episode. So I should say, first of all, that Professor Chibber is a sociology professor at NYU. He wrote a really interesting book years ago called Postcoloniality and the Specter of Capital, which is postcolonial theory and the Specter of Capital, which is about his issues with subaltern studies. And more recently, a couple of years ago, he wrote a book called The Class Matrix, Social Theory After the Cultural Turn, which is about how to think about certain kinds of intellectual challenges to materialist analysis, and in what ways it's in fact politically useful to think about materialist analysis. And I've certainly gotten a lot from engaging with that book. I wrote something about it a little while ago for my Substack that was then reprinted at Everyday Analysis, called Taking the Red Pill, William Clare Roberts versus Vivek Chibber on the Class Matrix. And somewhat related to those more abstract issues, and somewhat not. I'm sure that'll all come to bear in the discussion. Professor Chibber recently did a episode of his podcast for Jacobin, Confronting Capitalism, where he talked about identity politics, what's often referred to as wokeness, and I listened to it. I thought it was like a thoughtful and interesting discussion. Not everybody had that reaction. Jake, do we have some of the reactions that people did have? Yes. Trevor Griffey, whose Twitter bio identifies him as an academic historian at UCLA, says, "Fuck Vivek Chibber and his long campaign against intersectional analysis of capitalism." We have a prominent left-wing podcaster replying to that with "Amen." We have Dr. Ruth Marshall is kicking against the pricks. I'm not good, whose Twitter bio identifies her as an academic at the University of Toronto, saying, "You people are fucking cretins. Chibber is a laughingstock." We have William Clare Roberts saying, "Vivek Chibber is no different than Matt Iglesias or Jonathan Chait," which is fascinating in its own way. And at the time that all this was starting to happen, I did a short video for Twitter, sort of giving my own take on what was going on here. So let's play that. First, just as a general point, Vivek Chibber is a serious thinker. He's someone worth listening to. And honestly, I think the left would be better off if we did listen to the kind of critique that he has to offer. Second, this in particular was a good episode. It was a careful, analytical look at how the phenomenon that goes by the imperfect and often abused name of wokeness is best understood as a historically specific mutation of identity politics caused by, first, the way those politics became structurally enmeshed in universities, and second, the way this kind of toxic brew of identitarianism, PMC status seeking, and through those first two, lots of cancel culture, became supercharged after the murder of George Floyd because of the absence of a broad-based civil rights movement with a class analysis and material strategy that could have channeled all of that righteous anger and political energy into more positive directions. Third, it was a way more nuanced discussion than you would think from the decontextualized snippet of the transcript that I've seen go around Twitter. In fact, one of Chibber's central points is that the right uses the extreme unpopularity of all the alienating, woke stuff as a stalking horse for much broader attacks against genuine civil rights victories and against things like the accurate teaching of the history of slavery. And his point is that it's important to present a left perspective that defends what should be defended without counterproductively shackling it to all the alienating PMC nonsense. And I guess my fourth and final point would be that a lot of people on left-wing social media really need to calm down. If a Marxist academic like Chibber using the W word in a critical way is enough to make you this angry, at some point down the line, you've really lost the plot. So we also have our friend Catherine Liu wrote an article about this for Unheard, where she says in the final paragraph, and I think this is a fairly good summation of all of that. She writes, the point is that those of us on the left need more discussion of the origins of identity politics, the role it has played in creating nominally progressive liberal institutions, and its complicity with defanging actual radicalism. Chibber's intervention in this debate wasn't inflammatory, it was conversational, accessible, and reasonable. Chibber's work is the answer to the millions of Americans who crave a critique of democratic identity politics, but have only found it on the right. Viciousness of his critics only vindicates his arguments, which very nicely, I think, sums up the way I say this. But of course, there's no substitute from hearing from the man himself. So we are now joined by professor of sociology, editor of the socialist theoretical journal Catalyst, and author of those books I mentioned earlier, Vivek Chibber. How are you doing tonight?
I'm good. You can hear me okay?
Yeah. Yep.
Good. I'm great. Ben, thanks for having me.
Yeah, so it's been too long. So I think that when you were on before, we were talking about the class matrix a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, so that is going to be relevant, I think, to some of this, right? Kind of thinking about what happened to the left, and what a better version of it might eventually look like, which is definitely something I want to hear from you about, but. I guess I am curious when you think about the sort of strange little tempest about your article, or similar things that I've seen elsewhere. Like, I don't know, even last week there was a New York Times article that quoted Bhaskar Sankara and some other leftists saying critical things about corporate DEI initiatives that upset a lot of people in very similar ways, and I think that oftentimes the way that I will see people frame this, and the most interesting version of this to me is when it's from people who think of themselves as socialists, because when it's just people who think of themselves as liberals, then sure, whatever, it makes sense, right? It's sort of about what you expect them to say. It's like Hillary Clinton saying to Bernie Sanders, that breaking up the banks, won't solve racism, right? That's the sort of thing that you would expect from them, right? But I think it's more interesting when you have people who think themselves as socialists and Marxists, but are sort of still upset at the call for, the left to steer away from identitarianism and sort of focus on broad class-based politics. And oftentimes the way I see this framed, at least in the past, has been an accusation of class reductionism. But I've always been a little bit confused about what that was supposed to mean, because technically speaking, like, reductionism would mean you were like trying to explain one phenomena as really just being another phenomena. Like I don't know, like a full, philosopher, physicist might say that it's like, oh, all the other objects just reduced to collections of basic particles or something. And if what people were accused of was doing something like that about economics, that's like, oh, all this other stuff is just sort of complicated arrangements of economic phenomena, then that doesn't seem like it would be particularly politically relevant one way or the other, because it's like just not obvious what would follow from that. It seems like what people are really saying, or what they're trying to say when they use phrases like this, it seems like it really has nothing to do with like reducing one thing to another thing. It really seems like what they mean is that the real accusation is normatively not caring enough about non-economic
what they're accusing you of, there's a basic conceptual and theoretical illiteracy in the left about the words they use. And it's not just the swear words, any words, because it's really not a left, right? But what this is, what's happened over the past 25 years is certain words have become buzzwords. People use them when they think that they've been given the right signal to use a word, and then they move on without there's no forum in which the left could have a debate about these things, because there's no left intelligentsia. If by left you mean socialists, there's lots of people who wanted less cruelty in the world, and people to be nice, and a lot of these people who did the drive-by mudslinging on Twitter against me, that's what they are. Essentially, they're very unhappy, but somewhat critical of oppression people in academia whose careers depend on presenting themselves in a certain way, because it helps in the conference circle and in this little ecosystem of left conferences and left podcasts. It helps them get by in those things. But what they're really accusing you of, your definition of reductionism is exactly right. To reduce A to B means you say that A can be all statements about A can be translated without any loss of content to statements about B. So in sciences, there was an ambition that biology could someday be reduced to physics, which means that there is a hope among scientists that everything we know about biology will turn out to be translatable into statements about molecules and atoms, which is the prominence of physics, and biology will hopefully simply be collapsed into physics. Now, no biologist took offense at that. This would just be a way of showing the power of certain basic sciences, and biologists would then become folded into physics, because that's just the way the universe is. The reason they didn't take offense was their commitment is to understand the world, not to defend a profession. The reason on the so-called left, reductionism is considered a swear word, is that you're taken to be saying that a certain phenomenon does not have an autonomy of its own. It doesn't have its own logic. It doesn't have its own causal forces. It is simply an echo of something else, or it is simply something else parading as that phenomenon. So I'll give you an example. So to say that race can be reduced to class, suppose there's a race riot, and it turns out everybody on one side of the riot is a worker, and everybody on the other side of the riot is a capitalist. When you try to explain it, it turns out it was just the workers being really pissed off about their working conditions, but expressing it in racial terms. And there have been such instances, people step in and say, well, this is actually a class war. It looks like a race war, but it's actually something else. That's a statement about reduction, right? Clearly, when Marxists say racism or gender is rooted in economic phenomena, they're not saying it's just an economic matter. What they're saying is that it's constrained or caused by economic phenomena or economic mechanisms. That's not reduction, that's determinism.
Mm-hmm.
What you're being accused of is class determinism, to which the answer should be, okay, and maybe it's true. Every Marxist for 100 years who was a Marxist of color had said racism is caused by economic, including W.E.B. Du Bois, who today is presented as some sort of patron saint of intersectional Marxism. If you read Black Reconstruction, it is straightforwardly economic determinism. Du Bois is saying racism is caused either by employers pitting white workers against black workers, or by white workers to ward off economic competition in the labor market, mobilizing to exclude black workers. In both cases, Du Bois says, it really is a case of economic motivations being played out through racial dynamics. Now, he might be wrong about that, but it is an argument not of economic reduction, but rather of economic causation. I might be wrong, but since when is determinism a bad thing? Reduction isn't even a bad thing. If you can't use it as a swear word. You just have to show that it's wrong. The problem is that since literally nobody in the left, I mean, virtually nobody, is in a setting where there is a payoff to making the economic argument, they're easily swamped by their critics. And the reason there's not a payoff is nobody within the professional classes wants to hear that race is being constrained or caused or driven by economic phenomena, even if it's true. So the reductionism is a swear word that's used in an illiterate way, but what they really mean is determinism. And to my mind, Marxists would say, yeah, we're pretty much determinists about this because we think A causes B. Now, you can quibble whether it's determinism or if it's a high level of probability, if it's a probabilistic statement or a deterministic statement, but it's a causal statement. And it is in fact the case that until Black Marxism, William Robinson's book came along, it was just taken for granted that if you're a Black Marxist of color, what? I'm sorry?
Oh, Cedric Robinson, right?
Sorry, did I say William? I'm sorry, Cedric Robinson.
Yeah.
It was taken for granted that we have an economic explanation for racism. It's just after Robinson's work that it became much more, I think, fashionable and acceptable to say, don't even mention the economic, unless it's one in 1,000 causal factors that's playing into this. So it has no particular importance.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this to me is that the two, so one issue is, okay, are economic factors like really all that's going on in a reductionist way that in that sort of biology doesn't reduce to does or doesn't reduce to physics way, right? That which again doesn't seem like it would be particularly politically relevant one way or the other, right? Whether or not that was, that was true, right? Thinking that, like you don't become more or less concerned about, I don't know, endangered species if you think like all species are made out of subatomic particles, right? Like it's just, that just seems very, the one subject seems very distant from the other. And even with the determinism claim, it's not obvious to me, right? How this, like what the immediate consequences of that are going to be. Now, you could say, because depending on, I guess it depends on the scale of the claim. Because if you say that, okay, in the present tense, right, everything that you're talking about is being sort of continuously determined by this factor. So if you take away the determinant factor, the effect will go away, right? Then I get the political relevance, right? If you say
that is what the argument is. So suppose we say the reason whites are able to racially discriminate against blacks is that whites have monopolized access to economic resources. So that puts them in a power over blacks and Latinos or brown people. And the essential precondition to removing that power is to equalize economic resources. What that does is it doesn't eradicate prejudice. Prejudice is always going to be around, but it does eradicate the power that people have to act on their prejudice. Because if there's an equal distribution of resources, no one group as a group is in position to effectuate its prejudice against another group. So they can be prejudicial, they can be prejudiced, but they can't dominate. So the causal argument tells you where the levers are that you have to work on to change the things. If you deny that there is an economic basis to racial or gender discrimination, then your remedy will be exactly what I criticized in the podcast. Your remedy is going to be nicer. Have more people in positions of power. Change people's behaviors. Because it's no longer rooted in structural inequalities. It's no longer rooted in an unequal distribution of resources. This is why identity politics and what you might call wokery, the problem with it is not that it puts too much of an emphasis on race so that it ignores class. The problem with it is that it does not sufficiently address race. Because it is the organic idea of a particular stratum within these so-called dominated groups, whether it's women or whether it's people of color. It is, as Adolph Reed has been saying for years, and absolutely correctly, it is the class ideology of the ruling stratum within dominated groups. It's an ideology that stresses non-economic factors because for these groups, the economic components of their domination are no longer an issue. It's no longer a factor because they're on the top. They're wealthier people of color, wealthier women. So they're focusing on exactly what identity politics focuses on. Why don't we get the respect that we're due? Why don't we get the salaries that our white peers have? Why don't we get the representation that our white or the male peers have? These are the grouses of people whose upward ascent is being blocked. They are not the grouses of people who are struggling to make a living every day. That's why, therefore, they deny the salience of the economic, and that's why there's this hysterical reaction every time you criticize it, because A, you're attacking their self-identity as radicals, which is essentially a grift. And anytime you expose a grifter, they have a violent reaction. And secondly, you are trying to steer the discourse towards the people who, frankly, they have a lot of disdain towards, which is working people. They share the same class, let's just say class disdain for the poor as their white and male counterparts have. I'm sorry, the reason I'm saying this is as old as anything you'd ever imagine. There's all this discourse around how race is like a colonial domination. If you knew even the slightest smidgen about the history of colonial movements, anti-colonial movements, independence movements, this is just generic. Elites within dominated populations do two things. They steer the discussion towards the blocks to upward mobility rather than structural redistribution. And they pretend there is no stratification within the dominated groups. And therefore, there's no question of who gets to speak for people of color. Because if there's no stratification within them, pick any random one, and they can say, I stand for this community. Because these folks are in the position of having access to media, access to journals, access to newspapers, they're the ones who are speaking. and they can claim to be speaking on behalf of a community, so-called community, because it has no internal stratification. This has been going on for 120 years now. It's just because the US left is either, it's not really a left, and it consists of the same class of people. It has no interest in analyzing the phenomenon. And that's why they go kind of crazy when somebody points it out. What I pointed out is so basic, it's so generic, it shouldn't even raise an eyebrow. And if there were a left in the US, people would be saying, hey man, don't you have better things to do with your time than to point out the blindingly obvious?
Yeah, so there's a, like in what you just said, right? I mean, there's, I think, a critique of identity politics on the grounds that the sort of goals of it are not relevant to the kind of goals that that we should care about, right? That as or certainly at least that as people who aspire to there being an effective workers' movement.
Ben, if you aspire to race emancipation, identity politics fails, and I think we have to be clear about this. The problem is not that it is not geared towards workers' emancipation. I think it's perfectly valid for people of color to say, look, all I care about is my people.
But
if by my people you mean the vast majority of Black and brown people in this country, then you have to be against identity politics. Because identity politics expresses the aspirations of the top 10% of people of color, of women. So its flaw is that it fails on its own grounds, its stated grounds. And the reason it fails is that the people making the arguments in its favor, in fact, either do not have any interest in race emancipation or are unaware of the dynamics that keep it in place.
And by race emancipation here, you mean improving the conditions for the majority of people in marginalized groups?
Everyone, if you improve the majority of working class Blacks and Latinos and brown people, you will improve the situation of their wealthier peers as well. So I think this is the position socialists of color have had for 100 years, which is if you care about race, then you should care about the conditions of working class Black and brown people, not the ones teaching at Harvard. It's just simple.
Yeah. So I guess, thinking, taking a step back here, and thinking about, reasons why, right? There are people for whom that's not simple, right? So there are two ways that you could ask that question. One of them is what's the sort of diagnosis of where the ideology comes from, right? That's what you've just been laid out, for the last several minutes, that essentially you have this kind of class ideology of upwardly mobile professionals that has sort of been, that's an interpretation of emancipation for marginalized groups that kind of makes sense given the interests of that subgroup. So then, even lots of people who, again, might think of themselves as socialists, as Marxists, whatever, will still say, oh, well, I'll just take all that on board and we'll also do some other stuff, right? So that there's this sort of confused attempt to have it both ways. And then the other way you could take the question is, okay, well, if you do have people who, maybe are salvageable, right? Who, we'd like to convince here because, certainly, I don't know. I mean, I can think of a time when, like, in my own life as a young leftist, I, before I'd like read a bunch of, Adolf Reed and Vivek Chibber and whatnot, right? I didn't see things this way, right? And I did sort of vaguely assume that this kind of both and approach must be right, or something like that must be right? Because that was just sort of what was in the water, right? Of the left, or to the extent that such a thing exists in the United States. And so I think to anybody who is salvageable and sort of good faith about this, who is resistant to this point, I think that a lot of that is going to be about the idea that it sort of comes across, like the idea that you should strategically emphasize a class perspective as a way to, improve the situation of marginalized groups, never mind any other goal, I think reads to a lot of people as just sort of not caring enough about anything other than economics. I think that is really what drives a lot of people's reactions to this stuff. That they sort of that they hear all of this as like, oh, I don't really care about, women's rights, gay rights, anti-discrimination, right? Like I only care about this economic stuff over here. And I know certainly in your own work, I mean, something that I've seen you emphasize actually quite a bit, right, is that a sort of baseline commitment to liberal rights, which include, things like anti-discrimination. And in fact, a point that I've often seen you make is that, historically, socialists have actually often fought for, liberal rights, much more and much better, than liberals have themselves. And so, I was wondering if you could just kind of directly speak to that, right? The sort of like, why it is, right? Because you kind of said this already, but I think there are so many people who are so used to thinking about this in this other way, where the way that you sort of prove that you care about race, gender, etc., is by signing on to this kind of identitarian framework that I think it becomes very easy for them to miss the point, right? So I was wondering if you could just kind of generally speak to the way to think about those sorts of civil rights struggles for liberal rights, which are, for different issues have different timelines, right? That some of those are much more live issues than others, and how that relates to the sort of perspective based on material redistribution and, that you're emphasizing right now.
There are two ways in which you can dominate a community as a whole, the community as a whole. One is by legally restricting their access to public goods. And that Jim Crow is a very good example of that. When women weren't allowed to vote or allowed into institutions like universities and colleges, that's either de jure or de facto. That's another example. And of course, colonial rule is another example of that. A second way in which you restrict people is not by legally denying them access, but by depriving them of the resources to act on their rights. You give them the right, but then they don't have the access, the resources to actually act on it. I'll tell you what I mean by that in a second. But let's just focus on the first issue, which is the legal issue. So for hundreds of years, people born of African descent in the South were legally barred from access to certain things, whether it was restaurants, whether it was voting, whether it was other sorts of public institutions. And the first component of the civil rights movement was to say, this means that just because of your skin color, you lack certain rights. We will call them de jure rights, okay? Just formal rights in the law books. And that's unjust. And the civil rights movement, which was led mostly by socialists, including Martin Luther King, said, that lack of access to the same legal rights as whites have is a fundamental injustice. Every socialist supported that. Every socialist in the United States, I can't think of a single person on the socialist left who said, no, not good enough, sorry. Similarly with the right for women and women's suffrage, women's emancipations, women's access to universities, from the 1920s onward, the socialists and the communist left fought for those things. And obviously colonial rule was another such dimension. By the 60s and 70s, that battle was largely won everywhere. Now the problem became, even though you've given people of color these rights, they remain at the bottom of the economic stratum and in public institutions as well. So how do you give them access? The problem here wasn't that they didn't have the rights for these things. The problem was they couldn't effectuate those rights. What? You have the right to go to college, but it costs money. You have the right to good health care, but it costs money. You have the right to housing, but it's a combination of discrimination and money. How do you solve that? Well, one solution was, let's create some sort of legal positive discrimination for people, so that there's either an incentive or a quota in public institutions. You have to have X numbers, or we would like you to encourage X numbers of women and people of color. Now, the thing about that is, even if it works, it only affects a tiny percentage of that population. The second remedy was what Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King and the socialist feminists said, which is, in order to get, the problem with people of color and women is not they don't have rights anymore. They actually have all those rights. The problem is they can't act on those rights because they lack the economic resources to actually pursue the goals that they value. So any adequately feminist or anti-racist agenda has to be geared towards one of two things: either providing these public goods to them as a right. So now rights extend beyond simply voting and formal equality. You get certain citizenship rights, like Social Security is a right now, like Medicare is a right. Housing should also be a right. Medical care throughout your life should be a right. Childcare should be a right. Now, yeah, there'll still be discrimination, but now you have the law behind you. And because the law is behind you, you can actually get the state to step in on your side when you're denied access to these things. So there should be rights to public goods, not just the right to vote. But the second way was through economic income supports, so that because you're living in a capitalist economy, because it takes money to acquire decent healthcare, decent housing, you also, either through unions or through income supports or through economic redistribution, social insurance, you have more disposable income. All of this does two things. It gives you access to these goods which you purchase in the market. And secondly, it takes away the right of discriminators to lord it over you, because the state is behind you and you have more resources to yourself. So the issue no longer is rights. The issue becomes, what does it take to get people of color the universal access to the goods which they might have the right to have, but they lack the ability to have? That's what the left was always pushing for. That's what people like myself and Adolf Reed say now. And that's why within the stratum in which we circulate, which is the professional classes and elites, that view is despised, because it expresses the disdain that radical intellectuals have. And I'm using radical in scare quotes. It expresses the disdain that they have, not for the ideology, and let me be blunt here, it's the disdain that they have for poor people. And that's why I say I wouldn't really call it a left. This is where the left starts. If you have to fight over these things, argue over them, you're arguing with a carcass. This is not the left. There is no left. That reaction on Twitter unfortunately, it was just a sign that we have a large organization called the DSA in this country. I don't know what it does, frankly. There's no left. There's some left intellectuals who stick their neck out and get a lot of opprobrium, a lot of attacks for it. But I wouldn't call it a left.
Yeah, I mean, I think that something like the DSA, there are of course lots of people in it, who are involved, I think, in various kinds of, initiatives that I would find valuable, having to do with, labor organizing, housing stuff, electing, social democratic politicians. But I do think it's really marred by.
There are a lot of, as somebody once said of the Labour Party in England. There's socialists in it, but it's not a socialist party. And unfortunately, I think the view I'm taking here about race is very controversial, even in DSA.
Yeah, certainly I remember, I shouldn't have started the sentence with I remember, it happened like a month ago, but like a month ago, I did a public event with Matt McManus, talked to him about his liberal socialism book, and then afterwards, somebody in the crowd came up to me afterwards to object to something that I'd said, and what I said in the talk, in the discussion with Matt, was at one point, we were talking about Charles Mills, the philosopher, and we're kind of arguing about him. And I made the point that, look, if you if the thing that you're really concerned about is racial disparities, is, some people have, they're having like a greater or fewer, lesser percentage of some population having access to some good, then by far the sort of most efficient route to do anything about it would just be to provide that good to everybody, right? Because that's something that like you could, it's much easier to assemble a winning coalition, to fight for that. If it's not just going to benefit some people, it's going to benefit everybody. And one of the examples I gave was about health insurance, just because it's a sort of very straightforward example, right? If Black people are more likely than white people to not have health insurance, a really great solution to that would be Medicare for all, so everybody would have health insurance. And a member of the audience came up to me afterwards to engage with me about that, and she said something like, "Well, even if we had Medicare for all, then you would still have," and she gave some instance of doctors, of like doctors behaving badly towards Black patients. And
I think then we should take away all rights from Blacks. Why give them the right to vote? Because there's discrimination everywhere, is there not? This is just. What do you say about it?
Well, what I said was, well, what would your solution to that be then, right? Like what's the extra policy, beyond Medicare for all that should suggest? And she said, well, education. And it's like,
be nicer.
Okay.
Be nicer.
Like encourage people to be nicer, which of course is not really, sure, great, do that, but like it's sort of,
it's interesting. This instinctive rejection of universalism. It's mind-boggling to me, because suppose there were not this kind of discrimination. What would you say then? I would bet a lot of this audience would still not want those universal rights. I think it's just something they hang their hat on. I think what it really comes down to is what they want is something just for themselves. It's a kind of very, very deep tribalism that's taken over that section of the American population that calls itself progressive. Because I don't understand why you'd want to deny a white child access to healthcare just because you happen to be of a different race. It's so profoundly morally corrupt. I can't even make sense of it, Ben.
Well, yeah, I guess to be completely fair, the argument would have been, well, sure, let's do Medicare for all, but also, right? But then, like, my problem is that the but also is sort of presented in this way that it's like people who say, oh, that's not enough, you also have to be doing this other thing.
Of course, there's racism in this society. You're going to have Medicare for all, and you will have measures in place to try to make sure that it's not denied to anyone. But that's an argument within universalism. As soon as somebody says, yeah, but, they've shown their cards. So
yeah, please.
All I would say, Ben, is you're not going to, one should try to make arguments as effectively as possible. One should try to address all the objections to be intellectually honest. But I think you know this. The stratum that we circulate in as intellectuals will never be won over to this. Not right now. There'll be a time, if the working people, if the actual anti-capitalist left gets enough social weight, I do think a large part of the younger elements of the professional class will be won over to some of these universal programs, because their lives are not looking good right now, even though they're in the professional class. But the intelligentsia, the articulate ones, they get a lot of notoriety, money, visibility by being the battering ram for the Democratic Party and for the elite minorities. There's a lot of prestige, attention, and money that goes to people for playing this role. And sadly, when you go out and give talks like this, people coming to it are not working people. The people who come to these talks are mostly people who are edgy, are in these debates, who go to parties, who stand out as spokespeople for certain groups and all that. There's just so much more money in it for them to take the contrarian line, because they're in a stratum where they'll be the tiniest minority when they take the socialist line. And that's why I've been saying for years, unless and until the left breaks out of this section of the middle class, it's always going to be the tiniest minority. What's different about now than 40 years ago is this. There's a huge machine, political and economic machine, in place to reward anti-universalist tribal arguments parading as social justice arguments. It's just huge. It's so much bigger than anything the socialist left has. So you've got to try to, it's a challenge because you can't cut yourself off to criticism, because being intellectually honest requires that you address all their arguments. But it's a different matter to think, how do we convince them? As that's a sociological issue. And when there's interest at stake, interests always win out over morality and over decency.
Yeah, right. It's the Upton Sinclair line, right? That it's very hard to convince a man of something when his paycheck depends on not understanding it. Yeah, no, that's fair, right? So putting aside the sociological issue, on which I do think, I think your pessimism is unfortunately pretty convincing. I mean, I think you should, win over who you can win over, of course, right? But I don't expect miracles right now, without a, bigger workers movement. But just sticking to the intellectual side of the fence, right, and addressing those arguments. I did see something interesting last week, if only because of the source was so mainstream, right? So because I am in that world that you're talking about, right? Like, I see a lot of strange things that academics who might think of themselves as Marxists say that I often spend a lot of time thinking about, because I'm sort of frustrated by it. But somebody who's much more mainstream than that, right? So New York Times columnist Jamel Bowie. I'm not sure if we ended up getting this graphic. We might not have, but they have he had this. Oh no, we got it. So he had this thread on Blue Sky, which is where people go because they want to be in more of an echo chamber as a left of center person right now, rather than one of the bigger social media sites. And he's getting mad at Bhaskar and other people for things they're quoted as saying in this New York Times article. Bowie says, if you're somebody who's vocal about the way diversity efforts divide the working class, but silent about the ways that actual racism and discrimination divide the working class, you're a terrible person. Which I think is the second part of that is largely a straw man in any case. But the part that interested me was the follow-up tweet where New York Times columnist Jamel Bowie said, "Let me recommend this paper on class abstractionism, which argues that the structural primacy of class does not imply the political primacy of the class. And in point of historical fact, non-class identities have been powerful catalysts for working class mobilization." And he links to this paper by Michael McCarthy and Matthew Karo-Desan from a couple years ago, which is a paper that I've probably spent way too much time thinking about. So I was kind of surprised, right, to see somebody like Jamel Bowie mention it, although maybe I shouldn't be. And this is relevant to what we were talking about earlier, right? Because the sort of classic accusation that I've been, that I've heard for for the last several years against people who have the kind of perspective you were laying out earlier is class reductionism. Which you suggested earlier that class reductionism maybe is really a way of saying class determinism, and that you don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But there's this sort of strange updated version of that accusation, which is class abstractionism, which is the alleged sin of inferring the political sort of strategic political importance of a class-based perspective from the structural importance of class to how capitalist economies work. And I'd be very curious about how what you think of that variation of it, because it does seem to me, right, that in your book, The Class Matrix, you definitely don't say that these sort of structural facts about class are automatically going to generate class consciousness and working class mobilization. In fact, that's very close to the opposite of the central.
Exactly
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that article is. I never responded to it because you have to rise to a certain level of literacy. You respond to articles when they're one of two things. It has to be somebody really smart, really interesting, who's thought hard about it, which this one is the opposite of. Or it has to be somebody really influential that you feel you're compelled, which is what I did with post-colonial theory. This guy is neither. I know it's making the rounds on certain Twitterati and the lumpen intelligentsia. Look, so let me just not go into the article because it's not worth it. Let me just address the basic point, Ben, which is, if you think class is what drives the system, then does that have political implications? Could it be that even though the class is the motor, what you said, the structural factor that's driving the system, does it mean that class identities are going to be crucial to pursuing the interests of the working class? Well, yeah, of course. How could it not mean that? Is it possible that non-class identity? Now, what do we mean when you say the word identities, non-class? Is it possible that forms of self-identification that are not class-based, like maybe religious or ethnic or racial, could they play a role in consolidating self-identification as workers? Yeah, sure. Who on earth ever denied that? Who? What Marxist has ever denied that, including my book? Literally nobody. On the other hand, does it mean non-class social, institutional or social groups, if they organize themselves on a non-class basis? In other words, if brown people organize themselves just as a nation, whites, rich ones and poor ones, can play an important role in putting forward a working class agenda? The answer is, of course not. Otherwise, why would we be trying to organize people as a class? So what this guy has done, and I've known him for a while. Look, this is simply, he's really into neologisms because he thinks it'll make him famous. All he's doing is saying, this stuff is class reductionist, as you were earlier. And what I want to say, he's saying, like 1,000 other people who say they're radical, I want to say non-class factors can be just as important. To which our response is, can is a strong word. Sure, they could be in certain circumstances, but as a rule, typically, no. That's why you're trying to organize workers, not people of a certain color or people of a certain gender. And if you doubt that, please show me historically where this has been true. Show me historical instances when you have people organizing as a group that includes many different strata, in which that simply by virtue of being a group, whether it's gender or race or ethnicity, advances the interest of one particular group within that, which is the poor. I've spent my life studying just this because my basic day job is studying the global South, nationalist movements, anti-colonial movements. And the reason I came to the perspective I have is seeing, after 100 years of these movements, this perspective, this nationalist perspective that says the class divisions aren't important. What's important is our racial identity, ethnic identity, or some other identity. That has always and everywhere, without exception, been an elite strategy. Without exception.
And it seems like when people say stuff like this, there's often this implication that's hovering in the background. It's rarely explained in any detail that somehow or another mobilizing people politically on the basis, on non-class, sort of group identity bases, in the long term will somehow turn into like class-based mobilization, that like somehow if you do the first one for a while, then like as some sort of, I don't know, dialectical something unfolds, that like somehow or another that will become the other. And I mean, I'm like, I feel like I'm kind of putting words in these people's mouths, but if they're not saying that, I don't understand what they are saying.
Look, these articles, they're mostly gobbledygook. I hate to be rude here. They're mostly gobbledygook. People straining for neologisms. They're all circuitous ways of saying the same thing, which is we are very disturbed by anybody stressing the political primacy of class, even though we are willing to accept the structural primacy of class. And that's because, obviously, we circulate in an environment as academics where the political primacy of class is very unpleasant to people. Because right now, what's the height of radicalism, Ben? It's called hyperpolitics. What it's saying is, wherever you are, that's where you are. Remember, here's this movie in the 80s called The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai in the 22nd Dimension. And the slogan of that movie, always remember, never forget, wherever you are. No, what was it called? Now I just ruined the joke. It was something like, wherever you are, there you be, or something like that. But basically, politicize the space that you're in. Now, if that space is a classroom, if that space is an affinity group, if that space is a corporate headquarters, if that space happens to be an NGO, it's no less important than a neighborhood or a workplace. And to deny, wherever you go, there you are. Thank you, whoever. Always remember, never forget, wherever you go, there you are. I think that is the slogan of today's left. Don't prioritize anything, because that is an old style way of thinking. And Foucault told us micropolitics is where it's at because power is everywhere. So fight the power wherever you happen to be. It's all of these supposedly newfangled arguments come back to the same thing. There's no reason to prioritize organizing working people, the poor, over organizing professionals, the salariate, students, and corporate managers. This is not going to go away until then. There's an actual movement of labor. And I'm going to be very frank, I don't know if it's going to come back. The state we're in right now in the left, it's never been this bad. In the history of the left, it's never been this bad. So it might turn out that you, me, and a couple of other dozen people on the intellectual left are the last. We're the last of it. It's possible. I don't want to take it for granted that at some point there's going to be a resurgence of the left, but I can tell you this stuff is not it. All of this stuff. It's not it.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not it. So you said, so that last part, right? Like, I think it's the last part of what you said, right? That there's no guarantee of it. This is the perspective of that book, right? That the class matrix, that your argument, in there is that I know we've talked about this before, but it's been a long time, and I think it's relevant to what you're saying, and it's worth drawing out just briefly, right? So your argument there is that the idea that sort of economic structural explanations will explain working class resistance, and that people have to have been propagandized to explain non-resistance is exactly backwards. That there's sort of structural explanations for why most people's incentives most of the time are to keep their head down and pursue individual level solutions to their problems, and not involve themselves in union, socialist politics, various forms of resistance. And so this is in certain respects the conclusion is a bit depressing, that that there is no sort of deterministic guarantee that we're going to get an effective workers movement. We might not, right? And in fact, it's incredibly difficult to build one up, because you have to push back against those individual level incentives. You have to try to change the incentives by be like winning some small victories that help people see what they can achieve in the future, and so on. And look, in the long term, I mean, you never go broke betting on the house, right? I mean, if you're going to bet on the left losing, right? I mean, there's a lot going for that, but it seems like, to maybe tie this together with your critique of identity politics, the point would be, right? Tell me if I'm, got your perspective right here, right? That the point would be, sure, there's absolutely no guarantee of effective working class resistance and working class mobilization. That's, much of the point of the book. But it's the only thing that could work, right? Yeah. That there's no, this may be a very
it's not just the only thing that could work for broad-based movements. It's also the only thing that can work for solving social oppressions other than just class oppression. Let me just say why, because some of your audience might be confused about that. If you think that the basic problems that people of color face in this country have to do with, and we know it's true because when you ask them, this is what they say, every single poll says this. You ask Black Americans, Latinos, what's the single most important thing in your life? They say healthcare, education, housing, and prisons. This is what they say. And if you think, okay, we need a politics that, if it takes race seriously, will take the aspirations and the desires of people of color seriously, then you will take providing people of color with housing, medical care, education, and freedom from prison seriously. How do you do that except through better collective bargaining and massive redistribution through the state, through social welfare and insurance rights? But if you're going to change the priorities of the state and the wages that employers are willing to give you for people of color, how will you do it? Except through a broad-based, not in a tiny sectional ethnic movement, but a broad-based movement large enough and powerful enough to change the priorities of the state and to force employers to the table. You're not going to do it through tribal warfare. So that's why I keep hammering away at this. Class struggle is also the road to race emancipation. And this is not something that me and a few other people have invented. This was, if you want to have a who's who, this is the view of C.L.R. James, of W.B. Du Bois, of Walter Rodney, of Frantz Fanon, all of these people. Every single one of them until Cedric Robinson came along. So the problem, this perspective is necessary not just to revive the New Deal and all that stuff. It's also necessary if you want to go back to the promises that the civil rights movement made, the promises that the early feminist movement made, all of which has been buried under the weight of the current radical intelligentsia and their corporate sponsors. It's basically all there is to it. And it's true, we get attacked. I mean, the viciousness of these people is it's just extraordinary because they don't even address the arguments. It's a combination of, like in McCarthy's case, self-promotion, and some of these other people's cases, just drive-by venom and vitriol. We're the ones who try to make the arguments. What's coming from the other side is just, it's just swear words, unfortunately. So the only choice you have is to just, as you do, give them an argument. Keep on keeping on. The function of the argument is not to persuade these other people because there's too much money in it. The function of the argument is to arm your allies so that they don't feel cajoled and bullied and browbeaten by these gangs who swarm around anybody like a pack of jackals as soon as somebody tries to make another argument. And maybe someday in organizations like the DSA or whatever avatar of the DSA comes down the road and tries to organize working people, maybe these arguments will find some traction with them. I don't know. We'll have to see.
Yeah, well, as depressing as that can potentially be, I think that is perfectly said. I am tempted to cut it off there, but I do want to ask you one last thing, which is going sort of directly to the content of the Confronting Capitalism episode that we started out talking about, because it, it seems to me, right, that just sort of coming down from like the view from 10,000 feet, right, that you've just been talking about sort of long-term trajectory of the left. One like really basic pragmatic point, right, that you seem to be making in that episode was that right now the right wing, the Trump administration is getting a lot of mileage off of wokeness, and their opposition to it, and in fact, there are cases, where some of this stuff I don't necessarily care about. Like if nobody has to sit through another, DEI struggle session, in a federal workplace again, I'm actually just as happy about that. But
you should rejoice, actually.
Yeah,
because I think those sessions create racists.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is some evidence for that. So, my friend, Michael Seckman, did his co-writing a paper with. He did his PhD in cognitive science, and he was studying implicit bias and effects on it. And basically, the conclusion he came to, right, in his dissertation, as I understand it, is that doing anti-bias trade-ins has zero effect in actually reducing bias, but something that does have a positive effect in reducing bias is unionization, because having different workers from different kinds of racial backgrounds work together for common interests actually does empirically seem to reduce bias. That doesn't mean it
well, this is a conversation for another day. Yeah,
right?
It's a conversation for another day, but I actually think bias is a side issue in all this. If the reason unions matter is not because they reduce bias, even though they do reduce bias, is that they equalize power. And this is a corporate viewpoint that the real issue is bias. You'll never eradicate bias. It's just it's not possible. As long as there's racial, ethnic, gender heterogeneity, there's going to be bias. What you want to aim for is reducing power differentials. And that's the essence of it. And unfortunately, that's what this whole identitarian impulse has buried, because that's not what they're interested in. But go ahead, you were moving.
Yeah, right. So okay, bias, anti-bias trade-ins, I'm just happy to see go. But there are cases where this is used as a cloak for assaults on actual civil rights victories, on things like the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission. That was created as a direct result of the original civil rights movement, as attacks on the accurate teaching of American history, of slavery and Jim Crow, etc. All of that is clearly true, right? And I think that a lot of people inclined to sort of get mad at any instance of a left winger using the W word in a negative way will say, oh, see, they're, when the right attacks wokeness, they're lumping together all of these things. And so if you say wokeness is bad, you are therefore implicitly against all of that stuff. And it seems to me that a very simple, pragmatic point that, I heard you make in that episode is, no, if you want to more effectively defend what actually should be defended, you should be resisting that lumping together, right? That it's sort of a, it's an absolute disaster for the cause of getting people to care about anything that they should care about, being, defending against right-wing attacks, to say that it's a package deal with with the DEI trainings, with the with the affinity groups, with all of that stuff, right? It's like either you like all of that or you dislike all of that. Seems like sort of the worst possible sales pitch for anything that is actually worth defending.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I would say, Ben, there are a couple of issues involved. One is a strategic and the other is one of principle. Strategically, if you lump together things like equal opportunity and anti-discrimination law and even affirmative action, if you lump it together with this corporate DEI, the struggle sessions, all this stuff, then the problem is going to be people really hate the struggle sessions and DEI, the corporate version of DEI. But they're willing to defend these other things to a lesser or greater degree. If you don't separate those two things out, what the right is going to do is they're going to come under the banner of fighting the really, objectionable components of race justice, what parades as race justice. But under the banner of fighting that, they're also going to attack all the things that are defensible. And we need to be able to, therefore, as a left and among the liberals, say, well, we don't want to defend this other stuff because that's all a class project. It has nothing to do with race justice. Corporate DEI and that's what I was very clear about that in the podcast. And if people misunderstood it, it's because they wanted to misrepresent it. I was very clear. That is a project of the professional and managerial classes and the business community within minorities. But what helps Black and minority working classes is other aspects of the legacy of the civil rights movement. So strategically, if you want to defend it, don't treat it as a package deal, as you're saying, because you're defending the class interests of the fairly wealthy section of the minority groups. But second, Ben, there's also an issue of principle, which is one of the things, and I didn't maybe focus on this enough in the podcast, on campuses, over the past 15 years, what's happened is it's not just under the attacks of the right that an open and liberal and, for lack of a better term, inclusive culture of debate and discussion and research is not only under the attacks of the right that this has been eroded. It's also under the influence of what's called the radicals, the left, especially after 2020, when if you were a conservative on race issues, you weren't allowed to speak. If you didn't hew to the right line on social oppression, you weren't allowed to give a talk. Students would shout you down. Deans would come and shout you down. Journals, literally, I mean, I'm not exaggerating. If you read the American Historical Review after 2021, there's clearly a line that's laid down as to how you can write about race. And if you don't write about it that way, you'll either not get published or you will be forced to retract your articles. On principle, socialists should be against this. On principle, it doesn't matter if it's strengthening the right or not. If you're the only person in the room, if somebody is signing a petition to defend the rights of a right-wing intellectual, you sign it. If they're defending a petition to have a discussion around, say, a war like Ukraine, if they're defending the rights of people protecting Zionists, you defend that right. Otherwise, here's what's going to happen. Strategically, you're dead in the water because you might think, as I said in the podcast, you've got the power in the university to push back things you don't like, but you don't have any power. The only reason you have the power is the right never noticed you, never took any notice of what you're doing. Once they have your sites trained on you, they will use your illiberalism, your denial of rights as a way of coming after you and all the things that you cherish. And secondly, what are you on the left for if you are not willing to debate and discuss? What happens if you're in a union meeting and somebody stands up and says something racist? You're going to drive them out of the union? What happens when somebody in a union meeting says something that you object to or brings in a book you don't like? You're going to tell them to get out because they don't meet your criteria? If you do not figure out a way to address arguments and through that contemplate the possibility that you might be wrong, even though you have the greatest conviction that you're right. Ronald Dworkin, what brought me over is Ronald Dworkin once said in one of his great articles on freedoms, he said, the important thing about freedom of speech is not just to allow others to say what they want to say, but allow yourself to discover that you were mistaken. If you are in the interest of changing the world, you got to be in the business of understanding the world. If you're in the business of understanding the world, you better make sure that you put your arguments up against the most rigorous tests, which will come from the people who disagree with you. If you only talk to people who you agree with or who have the same politics, it's just a matter of time before you degenerate. So as a matter of principle, you have to defend speech. Otherwise it's not a right. Then why are you talking about conservatives coming after your rights? Why are you saying, do socialists stand for the rights of the minorities of oppressed? If you don't stand for the rights, then why should anybody stand for your rights? To me, this is, again, it's such a massive step back, Ben, compared to even 25 years ago, when the ACLU was defending the rights of Nazis to march. Of course, it should have been doing that. So,
Yeah.
as I said, there's a strategic and a principled issue.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I would add to that I think that there's a very basic contradiction for anybody who thinks they're a socialist between having a politics that's supposed to be about fundamentally changing the power relations in society and empowering the working class, and not caring about free speech for everybody, right? Because if you think that ordinary people should only be able to have access to some points of view that aren't too bad or too dangerous, it really doesn't seem to me like you're talking about people you think are capable of self-government.
The entire issue of self-emancipation becomes a joke. Basically, you're now endorsing an apparatchik, a class of apparatchiks who preside over the unwashed masses and will tell those masses what they are allowed to think and what they're not allowed to think. And that's emancipation. Again, as I say, this is not a group of people, these radicals, who are interested in democratic politics. This is really just a very narrow sectional interest that's taken over the left. And it'll preside over the left's final death if it's allowed to. They don't care.
Yeah, well, I think that if we are going to, at some point in the future, have a left that could actually be effective, that is going to have to come out of people taking a lot of this on board, and having a version of the left that incorporates a lot of what you're talking about. I think that maybe we can't get it, until things shift in a really basic way, so you can have an organized working class that can be the social base.
Let me say this. I don't want to be too doom and gloom. Let me say this.
Yeah.
Things are not as, if you just subsist on, Twitter and radical rags and radical blogs and all that, you would think it's over. The radical thought has been taken over by emotionally broken people who just want to spew venom at the entire world. But it's pretty small. The larger culture in the United States right now is so much, I think, politically better and more encouraging than it was at any time in the aughts in the 90s, at any time. There's a very broad disgust with the oligarchic nature of our politics. There's a very broad support of redistribution. There's an enormous support for trade unions. There's zero legitimacy for neoliberalism right now. Nobody wants it. Nobody in the broad public wants it, and they hate it. There is an enormous cosmopolitanism. If you think America is a deeply racist country, try going to a country like India. Try going to South Africa. Try going to just about any other country, even in Europe. This is a very cosmopolitan population. They just don't want a very aggressive, narrow agenda shoved down their throats, whether it's around race or sexuality or gender. They're actually quite liberal. With speech, they're quite libertarian. The culture is ready for a democratic and a redistributive, universalistic left that does not constantly want to pit one tribe against another, that just wants a broad movement of working people that respect each other. Yeah, there's a lot of racism. Yeah, there's a lot of sexism, but what do you expect? We're better positioned right now to wage a cultural battle against it than we have been in the last 60 years. So all the left has to do is step out of this very, very narrow and aggressively stupid substratum that is monopolizing social media because that's all they know how to do. Step out of it, go into the real world, organize people, talk to people, and what you'll find is the stuff that the people that you and I have been talking about right now, trying to find answers to, they are a tiny little subculture right now that mistakenly calls itself the left. And I think if we just try to present the people with a vision that says, no, this is radicalism, this is socialism, like Bernie did. Instantaneously, when Bernie came out, half the population came to him. All he had to do was to say, this is socialism, not that other stuff. This is what it is. Now, none of us are Bernie, and there isn't another one in the wings, but he's shown us, like the left before him, he learned it from the left that came before him. All the current left has to do is rediscover that and not be beaten down, dismayed, or demoralized by the sickening culture of the radical intelligentsia right now.
Well, that is a perfect place to end it. Thank you so much for your time, Vivek. People should be watching him, listening to him on the Confronting Capitalism podcast. On
the next one is on Wednesday. It's going to be on the history of tariffs and what they're for and when they're useful and when they're not.
Perfect. I will listen to that. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. All right. So we are going to go in just a minute to the post game for patrons. A couple of things before we head out. So if you are not doing it, if anybody who might be listening to this who lives in or near Los Angeles on Friday. Jason Miles from This Is Revolution and I are going to be at the Rainbow Bar and Grill in Hollywood starting about 6 p.m. It's in Slash's booth, assuming that nobody gets it first, or the man himself doesn't show up to claim it, in which case I suppose we could fight him, Marxist podcasters versus aging rock star. It would be a physical battle for the ages. But in any case, we did this last year. It was a lot of fun. So yeah, do come out if you are going to be around. Similarly, on both Jason and I on Saturday are going to be part of a panel discussion at UC Irvine on neoliberalism. I think that's happening at noon. I don't have all the details on that yet, but if you follow my social media, you will certainly see that corrected there. Okay, I don't like to speak badly about guests just before they left, but sometimes somebody says something so egregious that you just have to correct it. So for the record, the name of the film is The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension. So Professor Chibber, do better in the future. But meanwhile, though, we are going to go now to the post game for patrons. We've got Chris, the creator of that Finkelstein-Dershowitz musical adaptation that we played you most of at the end of last episode. We've got him. He will be hanging out with us in the post game, which I'm really looking forward to. I've spent way too much time over the course of the last month or so, especially watching that guy's videos on YouTube. It's just consistently delightful. So we'll be talking about all of that stuff in the post game. But if you are a patron, you should already have an email in your inbox with that post-game link. If you are not, there's no time like the present. Patreon.com/Ben Burgess. I will just say something I was thinking about a lot during that conversation. At one point during the conversation, it seemed petty to bring it up, but is that a lot of people including several people I could actually think of who have a perspective that's very different from what Vivek was laying out in that conversation, will get these like giant grants from like foundations to pursue research, on their perspective. And and it's the incentives are very bad, right? There's absolutely nobody who agrees with anything you've heard tonight who's getting those grants. And so certainly our humble podcast is entirely supported by patrons. So if you like what we do, do consider signing up. Patreon.com/Ben Burgess. Help keep the lights on. Jake has a lavish lifestyle. It takes a lot to support it. So, so you just got to keep that in mind. But in any case, if you are a patron, I'm really looking forward to the conversation with Chris. This should be a lot of fun. And after the sort of very heavy discussion of history and theory and all the stuff that we as the left are not doing right now, and all that we just had, should be a really nice palate cleanser. So looking forward to that. I will see you over there if you have written your name in the Book of Glory as a GTAA patron. If not, I will see you next week. Left is best.